Welcome to the Western Ohio PBIS Network. My name is Brandy Stiegel. You are watching the video that will focus on creating learning targets using content standards. So let's start off by defining what are learning targets. Learning targets are generic targets that are made up of short descriptive phrases that are going to be typically bulleted or outlined in a performance scale that is going to detail the knowledge and skills that your students must understand and be able to perform to demonstrate understanding of an academic standard. A performance scale is going to be a continuum that's going to articulate the distinct levels of knowledge and skills that are going to be relative to a specific standard. We will go over performance scales in another video. Now, let's talk about what are the benefits of creating learning targets and performing scales when you are planning instruction. Number one, the learning targets and performance scales are tools that are going to help you become more efficient and effective in designing and delivering instruction to your students. Learning targets and performance scales are going to help both yourself and your students focus on the progression of instruction through the lessons that you're going to be teaching and the units that you're going to be covering. Now, before we jump into how to create learning targets, let's talk about some important vocabulary that you need to understand in order to identify learning targets. The first term that we'll discuss is procedural knowledge. These are just skills or processes that the students will be able to perform that are going to be their way to demonstrate the understanding of the content being addressed in the standard. The declarative knowledge, that is going to be informational knowledge that students will understand in regards to the content being addressed in the standard. Basic processes, these are fundamental practices or competencies that supply the experiences necessary to attain an ability or necessary to obtain a skill. A few other terms, of course, we know what an academic standard is. That's just a statement that is generated at either the national, state, or local level that designates the approved educational benchmarks, and these academic standards are going to convey what students are expected to learn at a specific grade level and within a specific content area. Here in Ohio, we have Ohio State standards for language arts, for math, for science, for social studies, and other content areas. We have the Common Core standards, which were those national standards. Now, a learning goal, that is the educational objective that is going to describe what students will understand and be able to perform in regards to that content that is being addressed. An effective learning goal is going to be composed of clearly stated learning targets that demonstrate attainment and mastery performance of that academic standard. All right, so a few other terms that we want to discuss. Cognitively complex targets. These are learning targets that contain the level of processing or cognitive complexity beyond the requirement of the academic standard. So cognitively complex targets are taking the students deeper than what the academic content standard is asking them to do. Foundational targets, these are learning targets that contain essential prerequisite knowledge and basic processes that are not explicitly stated in an academic standard, but are necessary to construct the initial understanding required to reach the learning goal target. Basically, these are the prerequisite skills that students need to be able to do to reach the skills stated in those learning targets. The level of thinking required by those foundational targets are going to be below the level of processing or cognitive complexity required by the standard and the learning goal targets. These are things that the students need to bring to the table in order to meet the learning target or demonstrate the skills in the academic standard. Now, the learning goal targets, these are learning targets at the same level of cognitive complexity as the academic standard that identify the skills required to demonstrate mastery of the content. So Now that we have an understanding of some of the vocabulary terms that we're going to need to know, the prerequisite knowledge we need to bring to this, now let's talk about how do we create learning targets? How do we unpack those standards and create those learning targets? So let's start by talking about why do we need to create learning targets? How does that benefit us? One, creating learning targets is going to provide a focus for planning and enable you to work more efficiently because you're going to really be strategic and intentional about your planning. Learning targets are going to serve as a communication tool that set forth the criteria for a student to be successful in each lesson. They're going to function as feedback tools that provide information to you and your students about their performance and how well they are acquiring those skills that you are using or that you're instructing. And then lastly, they're going to help to facilitate communication between your colleagues, between your coaches, between our school leaders, and provide a focus for collaborative work in your PLCs. Now, how do they benefit students? Learning targets are going to provide an accurate guide to what they need to learn on a day-to-day basis. It's going to establish a clear criteria for what they need to demonstrate to successfully meet the expectations for each lesson that you're going to deliver, and ultimately what they need to be able to do to master that academic standard or those academic standards that you're going to be teaching. It allows students to become empowered and to take ownership and responsibility for their future learning. So it moves them from being passive learners and passive participants to really being actively engaged in their learning. So let's talk about how we are going to unpack these standards. So first thing we're going to do is understand declarative knowledge. Now, when we're thinking about declarative knowledge will usually be situated in the nouns of the standard. So as you can see in this example, you have your nouns are underlined. So in this case, we have, this is a reading, a kindergarten ELA standard. And so the standard says, with prompting and support, identify character settings and major events in a story. The second standard in this fold is, with prompting and support, ask and answer questions about key details in a text. So here we have the declarative knowledge underlined. These are the nouns in the standards: characters, settings, major events, questions, key details, text. The nouns within standard represent information such as vocabulary terms, facts, time sequences, generalizations, are principles that are essential for students to build upon as they attain more complex skills. By building declarative knowledge, you're going to lay the foundation for more complex content. Now, students will often need multiple exposures to the concepts through varied activities that allow them to systematically review their initial understanding of content and deepen that knowledge. As we know that typical learners need between 8 to 12 exposures to a concept to move that new learning from acquisition into generalization. So we want to begin thinking, how will we continue to give students exposure to some of the skills that we have underlined, some of this declarative knowledge? Now, declarative knowledge must be developed before students can gain the fluency or the increased level of control processing necessary to move on to the procedural knowledge. So these are the things they need to be able to know before they can move into acquiring the procedural knowledge of that standard, which we're going to talk about here shortly. Now, procedural knowledge is going to involve the skills and strategies and process of the standards. Now, the indicators of procedural knowledge in your state or national standard is usually situated in the verbs. So looking at those same standards that we just looked at, your procedural knowledge, in this case, it's circled. It is going to be things like, in this standard, identifying characters, identifying settings, asking and answering questions. These are going to be the actions or the verbs. Now, teaching procedural knowledge is going to require that you're modeling the skill, you're providing guided practice, you're providing feedback, you're correcting errors or misunderstandings, you're providing various types of practice until students have developed the automaticity and generalization of those skills necessary to independently apply that procedural knowledge in various concepts. So meaning that you have helped them and provided that modeling and guided practice and that feedback that allows them to move that skill or that procedural knowledge through those phases of learning, from the acquisition to the fluency to the maintenance to the generalization. So before we jump into understanding how to unpack the standards, we're going to talk about 3 different types of learning targets. Learning goal targets, foundational targets, and cognitively complex targets. Now, learning goal targets, these are statements of the knowledge and skills that students need to demonstrate mastery of a standard. Now, these targets are going to be derived directly from your state or national academic standards. These targets are going to identify what students should know and be able to do by the end of a grade or the end of a course. Unpacking the content standards will provide the information that you need to create your daily or weekly learning targets that are going to include the content focus, the cognitive level of thinking, and the precise language necessary to identify the learning goal targets. Now, foundational targets consist of knowledge and the knowledge and the basic processes that are going to build to the cognitive level of the academic standard that you're going to teach. Now, those foundational targets represent those prerequisite skills that student needs to master to achieve the learning goal targets. So we're going to talk about 2 types of foundational targets. We're going to talk about foundational targets for declarative knowledge. We're going to talk about foundational targets for procedural knowledge. Now let's talk about foundational targets for procedural knowledge. Now, foundational targets for procedural knowledge are going to include any of the basic skills or processes that students must perform to master the learning goal target. These procedural knowledge targets are the processes or skills that provide the foundation for future targets and must be achieved before students can be successful with the current learning goal target. So these are the skills that students need to be able to bring to the table in order to master the learning target. So you want to ask yourself the following question to identify the essential skills or processes that need to be targeted. First, what do students need to be able to do before they can meet the learning goal target? Did students learn this skill or process in a previous grade or a class? How am I going to know that? How do I know if they learned these things previously? Now, cognitively complex targets are created to help students extend and deepen the knowledge and skills of the standard. We're stretching them. Cognitively complex targets are going to stretch the students further than what the standard is asking them to do. We're going to those higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy where we're asking them to synthesize, analyze, evaluate. We're asking them to go deeper than what is being asked in the academic standard. So therefore, the expectations in cognitively complex targets are more rigorous than the learning goal targets in the standard. This category of learning target is going to require deeper thinking than what that standard actually requires, and it expects that students will think about the same content from that academic standard, but in more complex ways. Okay, so now let's jump into creating learning targets. So there are several things you need to do in order to create learning targets. The first thing is you want to be able to identify the declarative and procedural knowledge of the standard. You want to be able to chunk the standard. The next thing you're going to do is, after you've identified that declarative and procedural knowledge, you're going to chunk that standard and really create those bullets. Next, you're going to unpack the foundational targets, and then you're going to create cognitively complex targets. So let's look at each of those steps individually. Now, let's go back to that kindergarten ELA standard that we looked at. So step one in creating learning targets is to identify the declarative and procedural knowledge in a standard. So first thing you're going to do is read through the standard. You're going to circle the verbs or the procedural knowledge, and you're going to underline the declarative knowledge or the nouns. So let's look at this. In this case, the procedural knowledge are the verbs. They are to identify, to ask, to answer. The declarative knowledge are those nouns. We're going to underline those things: characters, settings, major events, questions, key details, and text. The second thing you're going to do after you've identified the declarative and the procedural knowledge, the next thing we're going to do is chunk the standard. So chunking a standard means breaking it apart into chunks, which are called learning goal targets. Chunking requires a careful reading of the action verbs and a word by word, and then converting those sentences and paragraphs in the standards into bulleting learning targets. So we're going to break down those learning goal targets. We're going to break the standard down into learning goal targets. We're going to do this by taking the verbs that we circled. So in this case, the procedural knowledge was identified. So we're going to chunk that. We're going to identify, what do we have to be able to do? What procedural knowledge do we need to be able to do? We're going to put that together. We're going to identify the characters in the story. We're going to be able to, that student is going to be able to identify the settings in a story. That student is going to be able to identify the major events in a story. That student is going to be able to ask questions about key details in a text. That student is going to be able to answer questions about key details in the text. And I know you're saying, well, why do I need to do that? It already states it in the standard. But again, we're going to chunk this so that we can identify each of all of the procedural knowledge, all of the declarative knowledge that those students need to be able to do, so that we can ensure that they have those skills necessary and that knowledge necessary to be able to demonstrate understanding of the academic content that we are going to teach. Okay, so now that you have identified in step one the declarative and the procedural knowledge that students need to be able to do, in step two, you chunked the standard and created those learning goal targets. Now in step three, you're going to move forward with unpacking the foundational targets. Okay, so remember, foundational targets contain prerequisite knowledge and processes that are not always explicitly stated in the academic standards. But the students need to know these, have this knowledge, or understand these processes in order to learn the current content standard or the current academic standard that you're going to teach, and to be able to demonstrate mastery of that. So to create foundational targets, you're going to unpack the declarative knowledge, remember the nouns from the standard, to identify all of the vocabulary, key concepts, and basic processes that students need to attain the learning targets. So in this standard, we're looking at an 8th grade mathematics, middle school standard. The standard is know that the numbers that are not rational are called irrational. Understand informally that every number has a decimal expansion. For rational numbers, show that the decimal expansion repeats eventually, and convert a decimal expression which repeats eventually into a rational number. The second standard that they are working on is an 8th grade math standard, an 8th grade number sense. Use rational approximations of irrational numbers to compare the size of irrational numbers. Locate them approximately on a number line diagram and estimate the value of an expression. For example, pi squared. So what we're going to do is we're going to, in the college, when we're thinking about the foundational knowledge, we're going to think about all of the things, all of the declarative knowledge that a student needs to be able to do. So we're thinking of vocabulary, key concept. We're also thinking of the processes, the procedural knowledge that they need. So in this case, what vocabulary do they need to know this standard? They need to understand rational numbers. They need to understand irrational numbers. They need to understand decimal. So these are things. They need to understand decimal expansion. They need to understand how to convert. They need to understand what non-repeating decimal is. They need to understand non-terminating decimal, all before they can do any of the things in this standard. Another foundational knowledge they need to bring to the table is that students need to know that numbers that are not rational are irrational. So they need to understand the concept of rational and irrational numbers before they can demonstrate knowledge, understanding, and mastery of the skill. They need to know that every number has a decimal expansion. They need to know that decimal expansion repeats eventually in rational numbers. They need to know these are the things that students need to be able to know prior. This is what they need to bring to the table in order to demonstrate mastery of this 8th grade standard. Now, the foundational processes will be simply just transferring the learning goal targets that you created in step 2 into that column that you are going to be focusing on. So basically, whatever you did in step 2 in the chunking, those learning goal targets that you created in step 2, that is what serves as those foundational processes that a student must do when we are thinking about unpacking those foundational targets. Now, step 4, remember we said those cognitively complex targets are going to take the students deeper into the standard. It's going to ask them to do more than just what that academic standard is asking them to do. So remember, cognitively complex targets are learning targets that require a level of processing or cognitive complexity that pushes students to dive more deeply into that context. We're on those higher ends of Bloom taxonomy and those higher levels of depth of knowledge. We're really trying to take the students deeper into that. Use these situations, apply these skills in real world scenarios, apply these skills in other scenarios. We really want them to be deeper. So when you're thinking about creating cognitively complex targets, I want you to carefully consider the standard. Then think of ways that this standard can be used authentically in the real world. How can this standard be applied to real world situations? And then you're going to rewrite the standard by replacing the standard with high level thinking skills. Remember, we have those lists of Bloom's taxonomy skills. You'll have that provided in your materials, in your session materials. Thank you for tuning into this video. Please don't forget to hit like or subscribe.